In this video I will give details of the plot of episode 3 of King and Conqueror, then compare it to the history, and I will then review it at the end. The episode starts with Harold in Flanders wanting to return to England to save Edith, but is prevented by a storm. Svien wants to help. Edith has been kept in a stockade and is bait for the Godwins. William meets Henry at the boundaries between Francia and Flanders, accusing Henry of playing the dukes off against each other. Tostig wants to help, and he goes to request help from Baldwin, who gives him a ship and asks for a favour and a replacement ship if the ship is lost. Baldwin at this time is also talking to his niece Judith about marriage prospects at the French court. Judith instead eyes up Tostig. Godwin is reluctant to back Harold's gambit back to England, but he relents in the end. Svien is put in charge of the mission, but Harold of the raid. Tostig is to remain behind. Count Baldwin is playing both William and Henry, and William finds this out and plans to use this to his advantage. William and Harold bond and bathe together in Flanders. Harold asks William for help with his cousin Edward. William calls Edward mad and he barely knows him, stating it is better not to be in each other's debt. They are then set upon in the bath by assassins, but they dispatch their attackers. Tostig courts Judith. After landing in Wessex, one of Harold's underlings wants to bury the rearguard that stayed behind to allow Harold and his family to escape. Svien agrees, but Harold says no because the mercenaries would then know that Harold and group are there. Harold sneaks into the compound looking for Edith. Svien wants to fight, which is against Harold's orders, saying, "Did Alfred sneak around?" The underling from earlier says, "Yes, this is what Alfred did," and Svien ignores him and fights, and as a result of this they are all captured. Emma wants money from the treasury, but the treasurer wants the king's permission, but Emma doesn't need or want the king's permission. Edward's wife confronts Emma over her plot, and they are both plotting against the other. Emma tells Edward she wants Gunhild, Edward's wife, in a nunnery, and Edward is reluctant, and Emma reminding him that she, Emma, put Edward on the throne. Harold and Svien are taken to Morcar, who has sent Edith to London. Harold offers Morcar a deal to become allies against Emma, offering half of the royal treasury. Morcar is initially reluctant, but in the end agrees, and Morcar mentions that Harold has 3 children, including the one Edith is carrying. William plots against Henry and plans to trap him in battle. Harold plans to free Edith, and he needs all of the Earl's support. Now, he already has Morcar and Mercian support, but now they need Siward, a northerner, to support them in unseating the king. William gains the Baron's support in his campaign against Henry. Svien and Harold travel north, and conveniently they are not discovered on the trip up there. They meet Earl Siward, who acknowledges Edward is setting the Earls up and that Emma paid him off. Siward is ill and has seen his sons fall in battle, leaving a grandson. Harold offers that there will be a Godwin stand-in of the earldom of Northumbria until Siward's grandson is old enough to assume the earldom. Siward agrees not to support the king. Svien and Harold are back in Flanders, again conveniently not being discovered, and they tell what has transpired to Godwin. Harold elaborates his plan, and Godwin gave his word to the king to remain in exile. Harold is, however, determined to get back to England and is a driving force behind the Godwin's return. Now, Harold wants to become Earl. Svien is angry about this, and Godwin says that Svien can become Earl of Northumbria, and Godwin is to step aside, and he appoints Harold as Earl. Turning to the history, the idea of not being indebted to each other, as William suggests, is fine, because at the top of medieval politics, you kept your own council, and the less you owed to other political nobles who were likely your rivals as well, was better, was key to their advancement. Now, Harold would have 5, maybe 6 children with Edith the Fair, born in the mid-1040s to early 1050s. There is debate about Harold's son Ulf as to whether he's Harold's son with Edith the Fair or Edith of Mercia. Judith was the half-sister of Baldwin V, who was Count of Flanders at the time of the 1051-52 crisis, not his niece, as stated in the episode. She was the last-born daughter and child, in fact, of Baldwin IV of Flanders. Matilda was the daughter of Baldwin V. It is not known what happened to Edith the Fair, or Swan Neck, as she is sometimes called, during this period, but she was a noblewoman from an influential East Anglian family, so the imprisonment in a stockade is likely creative license, bearing in mind that Edward's wife and mother were imprisoned in a nunnery. On a side note, Alfred the Great is mentioned by Svien. Now, historically, after the raid on Chippenham, Alfred was exiled to the Somerset Marches. He waged a guerrilla campaign against the Danes, where he formulated a plan. He gathered strength before summoning his army to meet at St. Egbert's Stone, and he went on to fight the Danes at Eddington, driving the Danes back to Chippenham, which he laid siege to, forcing the Danes to surrender and therefore making agreement to split England between Western Mercia and Wessex and what then became the Danelaw. Now, turning back to the history of this episode. Harold was not in Flanders. He and his brother went to Dublin, where they raised 9 ships. Godwin, Svien and Tostig went to Flanders, and they raised forces there. Now, whilst in exile in Flanders, Tostig did meet and marry Judith, so having Tostig court Judith in this episode is fine. Harold, after leaving Dublin, would raid and fight a skirmish at Portlock in the West Country, before meeting his father, who had raised forces of his own, in the Solent, which is behind the Isle of Wight, and they would raid the south coast. Now, the Godwins landed at Pevensey, and they gained popular support. Edward had an army and he wanted to fight, but council on both sides urged caution because they wanted to avoid civil war. The Earls Leofric and Siward were reluctant to send troops to support Edward for precisely this reason, and also perhaps there was concern about their positions, because if Edward could unseat the powerful Godwin family, could he not do the same to them? So that there's always that possibility as well. Now, Godwin then swore oaths to his innocence, and Edward, on the surface at least, agreed to this. The Godwins were then restored in full to their positions. The whole gambit of Harold and Svien sneaking around England, not getting discovered, plotting against Emma and unseating the king is completely made up, as is Harold and William bathing and bonding together in Flanders. In fact, William wasn't even in Flanders, and according to one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, William came across the sea and met Edward. He was also at the siege of Alencon later that year, so he wasn't in Flanders at all. It was Edward who put his wife into the nunnery, and it was not Emma suggesting it. Now, in terms of Emma, her power was removed after Edward's coronation, when he and the other earls turned up and took her lands away and confined her to a nunnery. She would later be released, but her power was gone. So the notion of Harold plotting to unseat the king, this was not the outcome of the 1051-52 crisis. The Godwins were restored to the centre of power. Edward's attempt to build his own power base failed, and Godwin power continued to grow, with Gurth becoming Earl of East Anglia in 1057 when Alfgar became Earl of Mercia after the death of his father. Now, Alfgar himself was actually exiled by Edward in 1055 and 1058, and Tostig would actually gain the earldom of Northumbria in 1055. Leofwine would get some southern shires within Wessex. Now, Alfgar, turning to him on a side note, he would actually use the Godwin strategy when he was in exile. He would ally himself with Grufford ap Llewellyn and a small force of Norse Viking mercenaries from Dublin, and he would launch raids, specifically the Battle of Hereford against Ralph the Timid, the king's nephew, and they would actually sack Hereford, and again in 1058, and he would get himself restored both times. Now, the Norse mercenaries were only a small portion of the army, it was about 18 ships. His main ally was Grufford, and indeed he would marry his daughter Edith of Mercia to Grufford until Grufford's ultimate demise in 1063. Now, turning back to the history of the episode, Emma's role in getting Edward crowned is debatable. She wanted her son Harthcnut to be king, which he did become king, and Harthcnut brought back Edward. Now, in his book, Frank Barlow notes Emma, in her autobiography, states Harthcnut had a better claim than Edward, and Harthcnut brought Edward back through brotherly love. But Barlow notes on the following page, in which he states this, that it was out of convenience, not love, and the pooling of resources. Tom Howard, in his book on Harthacnut, mentions the possibility of an illness that Harthacnut had, suggesting tuberculosis. This could also be the reason for Harthacnut bringing Edward back. The episode mentioning Henry playing the counts and dukes off against each other, and Baldwin playing both sides, this was part of medieval politics. There was the Duchy of Burgundy, Brittany, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, jousting for position, and now it's just part of the game. William gaining the support of his barons and plotting against Henry. To a point this is fine in relation to the actual campaigns Henry launched against Normandy in 1054 and 1057, because he feared Norman power, but not in the context of the show having Henry drive William into exile. In the 1054 campaign there was a two-pronged attack by Henry and his allies, which was defeated at the Battle of Mortimer, and in 1057 at the Battle of Varaville, a portion of Henry's army is trapped after crossing a river, and that portion is destroyed. Svien did not take part in the crisis of 1051-52 because he had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to repent for his sins. Now there are a lot of sins to repent for. In 1046 he abducted the Abbess of Leominster to get her lands by marrying her. There's also rumours that something else happened there as well. Edward refused and had him exiled. He first went to Flanders, and then he went to Denmark, where his cousin Svien was king. Now I should note that Godwin's wife Gytha was a sister of Ulf the Earl, who was Sven's father, and the reason why Svien is sometimes called Estridsson is because his mother Estrith is a daughter of Sweyn Forkbeard and sister of Cnut, and it's through her that he has a claim to the throne of Denmark. Now, Svien was driven from Denmark for an unknown offence. He then came back to England in 1049, and he tried to meet his brother Harold and his cousin Bjorn. Harold refused to meet him, but Bjorn did meet Svien, but Svien had him dispatched. Svien was branded a nithing, which means a wretch, villain, and outlaw, or a man with no honour. Godwin pleaded with Edward for Sven's pardon, which was granted in 1050, before going into exile again in 1051. William of Malmesbury says that on his way back from Jerusalem, Svien was dispatched by Saracens in 1052, thereby making Harold Godwin's heir. Alternatively, it's been suggested that Svien perished from cold, excessive cold, and hunger while travelling through Lycia in what is now southern Turkey. Godwin did not resign his earldom, making Harold Earl. Godwin instead passed on the 15th of April 1053, and according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was sitting with the king at a meal on Easter Monday, suddenly sinking towards a footstool, bereft of speech and deprived of his strength. He was carried to the king's private room, and he continued like this until that Thursday, and he departed this life. This has led to suggestions of a stroke. He was a man in his mid to late 50s, maybe even 60, which was old for the standard of the time. There is also an account by a Frenchman in the 12th century which states that Godwin tried to deny responsibility for Alfred's demise, but ended up choking on a crust of bread as divine retribution. There were also rumours of poisoning, but I think the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is more accurate and is a much more accurate source. Turning to the earldom of Northumbria, Siward was a Dane, not a northerner, appointed to the earldom of Northumbria by Cnut. Siward had two sons, Osbjorn and Wulfioth. Osbjorn perished in 1054, so well after the crisis of 1051-52, at the Battle of Dun Sinan, which unseated Macbeth. Siward's younger son, Wulfioth, was too young to become earl when Siward passed in 1055, so Tostig was made Earl of Northumbria, and Wulfioth never became Earl of Northumbria, but he became Earl of Huntingdonshire instead. He would actually go on to marry William's niece Judith, and she would betray him in 1075 when he got too drunk and learned about the revolt of the Earls in 1075, and he was executed. Their daughter would actually go on to marry into the Scottish royal house. Tostig was not a caretaker earl, and he did not give up his earldom willingly. Tostig ruled somewhat harshly and in a heavy-handed way. According to John Michael Kay in his book about called The House of Godwin, Tostig was perhaps overconfident. He tried to bring in financial and judicial policies from the south and enforce the rules more strongly than the Northumbrians were used to. Also, there were taxes charged to pay for the campaigns in Wales. and he was trying to bring up taxes up to the national average. And also there's the point that at this point there was a third penny from taxes and profits from dues and tariffs that would ultimately go to Tostig and indeed any other earl, and 2/3 of this then went to the king. There are also his dealings, or lack thereof, with Malcolm, King of Scotland. Again, according to John Kay's book, Malcolm conducted raids into Northumbria, and Tostig did not retaliate, showing a lack of leadership. Tostig also spent a lot of time at Edward's court away from his earldom. There is also Tostig's involvement with the assassination of 2 leading thanes of Northumbria. Kay mentions 4 in his book: Gamal, son of Orm, Ulf, son of Dolkin, and Gospatrick, son of Uhtred, and Sigurd, who were assassinated in 1064 during Christmas festivities, and Edith is connected to the latter too. And all this combined alienated Northumbria towards Tostig, and they rebelled against him, slaying 200 of his followers at York in 1065 and rising in revolt. Tostig is thought to have been close to his sister Edith and the favourite of both Edith and Edward. Edward was angered by the rebellion and wanted to crush the rebellion, but was persuaded to negotiate by the Witan, who wanted to avoid civil war, and sent Harold to negotiate with the rebels. And Harold agreed with the rebels to exile Tostig and appoint Morcar, who was Leofric's grandson, to the Earl of Northumbria. Harold was also keen to avoid civil war. In 1064, Harold was in Normandy, and there is a story of the oaths to William to support William's claim. Now, Harold negotiating to avoid civil war, could mean that Harold had his eye on the kingship as well, and he wanted to basically keep England united to oppose William. Tostig felt betrayed by Harold, accusing him of causing the rebellion, and he fled to Flanders. He then went to Normandy to meet William. It has also been suggested that he went to visit his cousin Svien, Estridsson, who refused to help him, although Svien harboured his own ambitions. But nevertheless, Svien had only 2 years before ended a long war with Harald Hardrada, so he was in no position to offer any assistance at this time. Instead, Svien offered Tostig an earldom, which Tostig refused angrily, and he departed badly. Svien apparently suggested to Tostig that he go to meet Harald Hardrada, and Tostig agreed, and he went on to meet Harald Hardrada. Now, in May 1066, Tostig raided the south coast, causing Harold to call out the fjord, and Tostig would then go on to raid East Anglia and Lincolnshire, which was then called Lindsey, in June 1066, but he was rebuffed by Edwin and Morcar, with some of his men deserting him, and he then went up to Scotland to wait for Hardrada, and indeed he would meet Hardrada later that year, and then conduct the Fulford and Sandford Bridge campaign. The show continues to be flat. It's not compelling in any way, and the history is all wrong. I mean, I do get that fiction stretches history to varying degrees, and it has varying degrees of toleration for it, but I just don't find the show to be any good. And if they wanted drama, then history does provide examples which the show has excluded. I mean, for instance, Robert of Jumièges, who Edward named as Archbishop of Canterbury, he was very anti-Godwin, and he supported the king against the Godwins. It has also been suggested that on his way to Rome to collect his Pelham, which is basically the Pope giving him his Pelham as a way of investing him as Archbishop, he could have stopped off in his native Normandy to invite or pass on a message to William. There is also the case of Godwin's son Wulfnoth and his grandson Hakon, who was the son of Svien, ending up as hostages, and they would find their way to Normandy. Now, perhaps when the Godwins returned in 1052, Robert and the other Normans were sent into exile back to France. Now, Robert, could have actually taken Hakon and Wulfnoth to secure his safe exit from England. Now, however Wulfnoth and Hakon got to Normandy, it provides a very good reason for Harold's trip to Normandy in 1064, and indeed when Harold returned to England from Normandy in 1064, he brought his nephew Hakon back with him. I haven't watched the later episodes yet, but I doubt it has utilised an interesting question or proposition regarding how much did William know of Hardrada and Hardrada know of William. Now, Tostig in late 1065 and 1066 first went to Flanders to meet his brother-in-law. He then went to Normandy to meet William, whose wife Matilda was a niece of Judith, who was Tostig's wife, although Matilda was slightly older than Judith. He then went to Denmark, maybe went to Denmark, and then on to Norway, where he met Hardrada, before then coming back down to northern France, where he launched his raids on the south coast, East Anglia and Lincolnshire, in the summer of 1066. Now, that does provide an interesting question as to how much each knew of the other. All this could have been utilised and had sufficient research been done and implemented, but it hasn't been done. So, again, they've missed out a good bit of history. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.